Hi, I'm Kirby Allison, and today I'm very excited to welcome Christopher Coates into our office, all the way from Scotland. Christopher is the editor-in-large of Whisky Magazine, one of the largest and most important magazines out there focusing on the world of whiskies. He is also a good friend. We had the pleasure of meeting during, I guess, each of our first trip to Cuba last year as a guest of Hunters and Francal. And Chris also shares the distinction of being the lead judge of the
World Whiskies Awards,
which is a pretty significant competition. I mean, it, in many ways, wouldn't you describe as the preeminent kind of whiskey competition in the world?
Exactly. We over 1,700 entries each year.
That's incredible. I don't even know how you whittle that down to winner. And then also having recently served as one of the judges on the perfect pairing competition for the Habanos World Day that just happened in London, of course, with Trinidad. So when it comes to all things whiskey and then where that intersects with cigars, Christopher is a foremost expert, and it's a privilege to welcome you in the office. This is something we've been wanting to do for a long time, which is to walk through a framework of how one might approach the pairing of spirits with cigars. And in this case, we've got Scotch whiskey, single malts, but the framework is one that could be applied to almost anything. Is that correct?
Exactly. So I think a lot of people, they look for a quick fix to things, right? So they go, I want to know which whiskey pairs with this cigar or which wine will pair with this cigar. And it's sort of, I tell people sort of take a step back and you know, think about this methodically. And this is actually, we're going to be using a framework that was taught to me by Maggie Kimball, the content editor of our sister title, American Whisky Magazine. She's been teaching this framework for well over a decade, and it really resonated with me the first time I heard her speaking about it. So rather than dictating to others, this is what you should drink with this cigar, what we do is encourage a way of thinking or a philosophy that will help people tease out those whiskies that are going to help them enhance their cigar rather than fight with it.
Yeah, and it's an interesting, step in one's journey of connoisseurship, is that point where you begin experimenting with enjoying two things together. And I know that the first time that I enjoyed what was truly a magnificent pairing, it was a profound moment where I was able to experience in a real way that the sum is greater than the parts whenever you have a really good pairing. And that's takes one's enjoyment and one's experience to the next level and adds dimensionality to it.
Exactly, and what we're going to be talking about today is also this idea of dynamic flavor. So rather than being able to taste a whiskey and taste the cigar and only experience the distinct flavors of one and the other, we want to see how they're going to interact, but then also how they're going to change over time. So, for instance, maybe one of these whiskeys will pair best with the first third of the cigar, and another one will pair better with the second or third, or the final third. So, or maybe none of these will pair properly at all, and maybe we won't like either of them. Maybe we'll have different opinions.
The case today.
I think we'll manage to do it.
But we must pass scrutiny.
Exactly.
Right? And
exactly.
So that's our work today. So talk to us a little bit about what you brought, because I know that you've always got something interesting up your sleeves, and you've got access to some absolutely incredible whiskeys. So what is it that we have the privilege of experimenting with today?
Well, what I wanted to bring were whiskeys that also would allude to the craftsmanship or the focus on craftsmanship and tailoring that your channel is all about. So, but also I know that your channel focuses a lot on multi-generational, family-owned businesses. So I really wanted to be able to shine a light on that in the Scotch whisky space as well. And what we'll be starting with is a Tamdhu 18 years old. This is 100% sherry cask matured single malt from Speyside in the northeastern Highlands of Scotland. This is a family-owned distillery. The Ian MacLeod Distillers is owned by the Russell family. And what Tamdhu in particular is known for today is this 100% sherry cask maturation. And beyond that, the fact that they don't just use any old sherry casks they can get their hands on, they dictate to the cooperages and to the bodegas that they work with in Andalusia, in the southwestern region of Spain. They dictate to them, this is the type of oak we want, this is the size we want, this is the toasting profile that they want, and these are the types of wines we want to be used for seasoning. So I thought, here's the first whiskey, it's family owned and has a tailored approach to its maturation.
Truly bespoke.
Exactly. Then we have Springbank here, which is today arguably the most sought after single malt on the planet. They have never, I would be very surprised if they've ever spent a penny on marketing. They are all about the craft. They're all about historic production practices. So they've been in the same family since the founding of the distillery.
Wow.
So that's really quite something. And they, through a combination of economic reasons and stubbornness and also just commitment to what they do, they didn't go through the modernizations of the 20th century that almost every other distillery in Scotland did. So here we have arguably the most old-fashioned, traditional type of Scotch whisky available on the planet. This is their sort of flagship product. This is their 10 years old single malt whisky, and we'll go into a little bit more later about what makes this one special.
Yeah. So that's like the John Lobb of whiskeys. You know,
Exactly.
You walk in and it even smells the same as it did 150 years ago.
And this distillery looks like if you put people in period dress, you'd be forgiven for thinking you'd gone back in time. It's wonderful. And then finally, we have what I think is an excellent example of where, with the right drive and commitment, how you can actually found a new distillery using these same principles that Springbank have been the custodian of since their founding. So Kilchoman here is a family-owned distillery owned by the Wills family on Islay, which is a small island off the west coast of Scotland, and very famously it's the spiritual home of peated whiskey.
Yeah.
Historically, peated whiskey was made all over Scotland, but Islay is the capital of peated whiskey. This distillery is relatively new. It's only a couple of decades old, but despite that, they from the very beginning have had this goal, this vision of 100% Islay whiskey, as in anything that they can get from Islay. They wanted to use Islay barley, for instance. Well, until Bruichladdich and Mark Rainier, who was another entrepreneur on Islay, started working with farmers, you couldn't get Islay barley. I mean, the growing season's tiny, the soil isn't that great, but they were like, no, we want to see if we can make this work. And today, what we're going to be tasting is their 100% Islay, the 13th edition, and that is, the barley's grown on Islay, it's malted at the distillery, and the full production process and even the bottling takes place on Islay. Yeah. So here we have three whiskies that really speak to the bespoke and crafted approach that I know that you appreciate.
Yeah, very kind. I mean, amazing. It also speaks to the breadth of Scotch whiskey. We've got 3 different regions from Scotland, right, and showcasing the different styles that make up a very kind of dynamic ecosystem of different producers and whiskeys, which is part of the joy, is that discovery. So I don't think I've ever had any of these 3. So that's amazing. Well, this is exciting. Well, you brought the Scotch. I can certainly provide the cigars. I think we should take a moment and maybe go check out the Vigilant Cigar Keep Walk-in Humidor and see what we can come up with. And I think that, of course, we've got plenty of Cuban cigars, so we'll have to pair some Cuban cigars with these beautiful single malts.
Exactly, and I've been looking forward to seeing your humidor for a very long time, so let's go.
Yeah, let's go check it out. Okay, well, that was fun. A lot of choices, but I think the most appropriate choice for 2024 is Trinidad, of course, a brand that is celebrating its 55th anniversary and truly an icon of Habanos tobacco. I mean, right up there alongside Cohiba, a brand that I've spent a lot of time exploring the stories of this year with our Trinidad series. What I like about Trinidad is that, really in many ways I consider it to be a medium blend. It has more a Seco than, say, a Cohiba that allows it to be a little bit sweeter and more approachable. The Topes is a 56 ring gauge by 4 7/8 inches. So the ring gauge is gonna give us good smoke, right? And we're not gonna be rushed for time. So,
which is exactly what we want because we have 3 whiskies to work through.
3 whiskeys to work through. It's hard work. And let's take a look at these beauties. So here we have it, the Trinidad Topes. This, of course, is EMS, English Market Selection, 2022. Let's look on the bottom. What's the box date? 2021 box date. So this has a little bit of age to it as well. So, Christopher, if you want to do the honors.
Thank you very much. These look absolutely spectacular.
Yes. I mean, Trinidad, with the repricing strategy has, really been kind of repositioned, really in its rightful place alongside Cohiba. That also meant price increase. So I don't have the privilege of smoking these as often as I once did. This particular Vitola as well, I find that I generally am smoking either a Trinidad Fundadoras, right? But I didn't think that would offer us the volume of smoke. Or the Coloniales, which again is 40-42 ring gauge, right? Slightly shorter cigar, great mid-afternoon or late evening cigar. I oftentimes come home and will smoke one of those.
Me too. It was the cigar. It was the first box of cigars I ever bought. Was a box of Trinidad
right?
Coloniales, and it's what really made me fall in love with the brand.
Well, it's not a bad place to begin, with your palate and taste, it's no surprise that you ended up at the top, from the start. But this is a great smoke. So, if you want to do the honors, this is the El Casco Cutter, my favorite.
That's great, and.
So let me see, hold on. So there's a particular trick to this where it needs to hinge in the fingers.
Okay.
Otherwise, if you do it like that,
it'll
kill your cigar. So I think that's right.
So we can talk about the lovely pigtail.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So Trinidad has several iconic characteristics to its construction that require a very skilled torsador. So whenever we were touring the Trinidad factory, I mean, one of the things that was striking is, one, the factory is not located in Havana. In 2003, whenever they were expanding the brand, Habanos had to find a factory other than El Aguito that would be able to really dedicate itself to Trinidad and support the volume. And instead of choosing a factory in Havana, in the hustle and bustle and kind of chaos of Havana, it's beautiful, but can be chaotic. They found a small factory located in Pinar del Rio, which is where all of, it's in Vuelta Abajo, which is the region producing the best tobacco in all of Cuba that's used exclusively in Habanos cigars. A small factory in the city with less than 30 torsadors, I think there's 28, of which 22 of them are the highest level 9 rating. And that factory dedicates itself almost exclusively to rolling these cigars. And so there's an incredible story of provenance, right? I mean, you talk about some of these small family-owned, distilleries committed to doing things the old-fashioned way. And in many ways, I feel like that's Cuban tobacco, that's Habanos tobacco. By virtue of the fact that they, in many ways, been kind of shut off from the world, it's become a time capsule, for better or worse, right? It's allowed them to really preserve their unwavering and really singular commitment to the quality, craftsmanship, and tradition of their style of making cigars. Nice soft flame. We've got all afternoon. That virgin puff, as Eddie Sahakian would call it, is really something.
It really is. I found that there's a particular flavour with Trinidad cigars that I struggle to find elsewhere. I mean, occasionally it crops up. I've often found it difficult to sort of put my finger on it, but I think there's a sort of, some people might not like this phrase, but I think there's a slight minerality to Trinidad cigars that I don't find elsewhere. It sort of reminds me of reminds me of when you have sort of Borderies cognac or Chablis perhaps, sort of this delicate sort of flinty note to it that I really love. It's very, very subtle. It reminds me a little bit of when there's a tiny little bit of sulfur in a whiskey. So we'll talk a little bit later about how there's a slight sulfur note in Springbank, which, if it was too pronounced, it would be unpleasant. But when it's just a little bit there, adding a little bit of complexity, I think it's part of what adds to the allure of Trinidad for me.
Well, there's a real refinement to Trinidad. Whenever this brand was initially conceived, it is amazing how this existed completely shrouded in mystery all the way through 1992. And they made a decision to really differentiate this from Cohiba to make it more approachable. So Cohiba is a beautiful, complex, really kind of medium to full-bodied cigar. With the Fundadores, which was really modeled after the Lancero, right, or the Liguito No. 1, which is a 38 ring gauge. And you find that through the rest of the brand. So in 2003, whenever they expanded it, they were able to take that foundational blend that Raul Valadares, very intentionally said when he created it, he was creating a blend for a brand, not a cigar. And they demonstrated the full range, and you see that here, right? Yeah. It's got a little bit more strength because of the ring gauge and the amount of smoke that you get by virtue of that. But it still has that kind of roundness and smoothness. You still taste a little bit of cream, right? But it's not as creamy as, say, a Romeo and Juliet. So you still have the complexities. You still have, that flavor that you get from a fuller-bodied cigar without being overwhelming. Absolutely beautiful blend. Approachable, but still has that complexity and that nuance to it. At least for myself, I love so much about a Habanos cigar. And of course, we saw that on full display in London at the Habanos World Day, and I really enjoyed the perfect pairing that was presented there. You were a judge, and so I think it was, 8 different contestants that came and presented different pairings with Trinidad cigars. What was that like? Allow us to kind of peek into the backstage, if you will, of what it was like to be a judge and see the variety of pairings.
So I think what was first of all, it was an honor to be invited by Hunters and Francow to be a member of this judging panel. I have to say I was I had to. I was sitting next to Ana Lopez, the former marketing director of Habanos and now head of marketing at Hunters and Francow. Sitting next to her and having that wealth of cigar knowledge was incredible.
Yeah, well, and then Jimmy, of course.
And then, of course, Jimmy McGee, my good friend, who very much took me under his wing when I first expressed interest in writing about cigars. I don't think I'd be sitting here today if he and the team at Hunters hadn't shown me the support that they have.
Yeah. And he runs their Masters of Habanos program, which is really a pioneer in the education of cigar sommeliers.
Exactly, and all of the contestants that came to the Trinidad Perfect Pairing competition had been through that program and were masters of Havana cigars. They came from retailers, restaurants, and private members clubs as well. There were some individual contestants and some people who sort of came as pairs to present together. So the runner-up of competition was Safira from the restaurant Sparrow Italia, and she presented a pairing that honestly I think it wasn't just one of the best that we were presented with on the day, but I actually think it was one of the best pairings of any kind that I've ever experienced.
And this was the runner-up.
This was the runner-up. This was the runner-up. Very, very stiff competition. She presented a Chateau Suderat vintage Sauterne dessert wine with a Trinidad Vigia. And then a slice of burnt Basque cheesecake. So I don't know if you've had burnt Basque cheesecake. It's sort of it's almost like the top of a cheesecake with no base, and it's baked, and it's a little bit sort of wobbly and jelly-like, and incredibly creamy, incredibly rich. But importantly, it's not done when you're making it until the top is burned. So she alluded to it's a little bit like a cigar. The cigar isn't finished truly until it's been lit. So. But beyond just the nice story, what was very clever about that pairing is that the cigar is sort of a medium blend, but sometimes they can inch into being a little bit stronger. But the Sauterne dessert wine with its fruit and its gentle mineral character sort of really enhanced the flavors of the Trinidad. Those two went very well together. and then you would sort of take a puff, and then afterwards, when you sort of wanted to almost like reset the palate, you'd have a little taste of the cheesecake, and this lovely creaminess, viscous creaminess would coat the mouth, and they just really went very, very well together.
Okay.
But then the winner was a presentation made by Antonius and Robert from Burley Cigars, and they gave us a canchanchara cocktail, which is a very traditional Cuban cocktail made normally with aguardiente. But they actually chose to use an eminente rum, which has some aguardiente blended into it. And they presented that alongside a chocolate bar where the chocolate itself had been smoked with tobacco smoke.
No kidding.
So it was the preparation that went into it was incredible. Also, they're a fantastic double act. So I really enjoyed seeing them both at the judging, but then on stage at the Habanos World Days in London. They controlling the room, and everybody eating out the palm of their hand, and just really loving the cocktail. It's very accessible as well. And they also importantly did a non-alcoholic version as well, which I really, really enjoyed, which was almost like an iced tea. And both of those went phenomenally well with their chosen Trinidad cigar.
And were there any Scotch pairings?
Well, surprisingly, there weren't, and I think it's quite interesting that I did speak to some of the contestants afterwards, and I out of curiosity asked them, did you consider a whiskey? And it was quite funny. A number of them said that they actually thought that would to be too obvious. So I thought, well, now I knew that we'd be meeting to have a smoke, I thought, well, maybe we can do our own Trinidad perfect pairing. So hopefully today we're going to find a whiskey, or maybe even just a style of whiskey that we think goes particularly well with the Topes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're just now getting past, kind of really into that first third, right? And, you need to really kind of smoke into it a little bit to begin experiencing the full, breadth of the blend. And so it's a perfect moment for us to pour something. Where is it are we starting? And in going through a tasting or a pairing, methodology or framework, these look as though, it's also tallest to shortest, but also darkest to seemingly lightest. Is there a particular approach that you would have in setting this up to ensure that, the maximum space of opportunities created to fully experience these together?
Exactly, you're completely right, and the fact that it's tallest to shortest is good luck and coincidence. But I did very deliberately choose these whiskies, and it wasn't just because of the incredible stories and the quality of them, but also because they represent three very distinct styles of whiskey. And I think whenever you're trying to find a perfect pairing, if you're really starting from scratch, what you want to do is probably pick the cigar you want to pair with, and then once you've picked the cigar, you choose your spirit category, and in this case, we've gone for whiskey. And then I think what you need to do is break down some sort of key flavor profiles that you think might work. In this case, we're actually starting with the oldest whiskey, which is 18 years old, so it's going to have flavors that you wouldn't find in a younger whiskey. This is also a unpeated, heavily sherried, very fresh fruit forward, dried fruit forward whiskey. We're then going to be moving on to the Springbank, which is matured in a combination of ex-bourbon barrels and sherry casks. And it's also medium, sort of light to medium peated. So there is a little bit of peat used in the production process. So we're just starting to introduce a little bit of smoke from the whiskey. And then finally, with the Kilchoman, we're actually having a 100% ex-bourbon matured whiskey, so American oak, and this is a heavily peated whiskey. So we're going from not smoky at all to very smoky, and we're going from sherry cask through a combination of both sherry and American oak ex-bourbon, and then finally into the 100% American.
Exciting. Well, let's get started.
So now we've covered the order in which we're going to taste the whiskies, we're going to talk a little bit about how we go about this tasting. So first of all, we obviously need our cigar lit, and as you said, sort of get it going a little bit and start considering the flavors that we're experiencing. And then what we're going to do is choose our glassware. Now, some people are diehards of rocks glasses or tasting glasses like these Glencairn glasses, and I would usually say to people, choose the glass that suits you and the moment that you're enjoying your whiskey. And if you want some ice in it, that's absolutely fine. I know you enjoy the sound that comes from using a crystal glass with a nice block of ice in it. But today, because we're going to be assessing flavors, what we want is something with a tulip-shaped profile. So here we have the iconic The Whiskey Glass, which is made by a company called Glencairn Crystal. In many ways, they have sort of cornered the market on whiskey glasses. They invented this shape, and today it's used by distillers in all parts of the world, and it's even bled out of whiskey into other spirit categories. They do produce a wide variety of different glasses. So for instance, some people, when they're doing assessment like this, they would prefer to use a copita, which is a glass that's commonly used for drinking and assessing sherry wine. So that's a sort of stemmed glass. It's almost like if you took the little stubby base of this and put a tall stem on it. So those are the two types of glass I would usually suggest for liquid assessment when really considering. And you want that because they're going to be concentrating aromas towards your nose. So if you have a rocks glass, there's actually quite a lot of it escaping around your face. And really what you want to be able to do is concentrate those aromas towards your nose to make sure that you can assess them properly. In terms of the order and the way in which we're going to go about this, we're going to pour the whiskey, we're going to have a little taste, we're going to have a draw on the cigar, think about the flavors. We'll then go the other way, we'll have another draw, and then we'll have another taste. Consider whether the flavors are different, going one way than the other. Then if we wish to, we might add a little bit of water to the whiskey, because again, some people can be sort of die-hard purists and they say you don't add anything to it, but really we want you to enjoy it. And if adding a little bit of water will actually open the whiskey up and present aromas and flavors that we wouldn't otherwise have found in the spirit. And then finally, what we're going to do is we'll work through the whiskies, and then hopefully we'll get to a point where we can actually try each of the whiskies with each third of the cigar, and we can come to the end of it, and maybe we'll come to some conclusions about which ones we like.
Great. Well, let's get started.
Great. A measure of the... If you need more, we can get you more. So in the late 19th century, there was a boom going on in the Scotch whisky industry, and a number of distilleries had been built from the mid-19th century onwards. And by the 1890s, it was sort of Scotch whisky mania. Actually, it was very similar to what's happening right now. The whole world was drinking Scotch whisky. And a consortium of distillers came together to found what they thought would be and ended up being the sort of most technologically advanced distillery of the time. And that was Tamdhu Distillery near Knockwando in Speyside in northeastern Scotland. So they came together, and very soon after the founding and when the spirit first ran, they began importing large numbers of sherry casks in which to fill their whiskey. So at the time, sherry was a popular drink and had been for over a century before that time. Massive amounts of sherry were being drunk in the United Kingdom. And what would happen is it would be shipped in cask from Spain and then bottled once either by the grocers or sometimes by the brand owners once it had been landed in the United Kingdom. And then after that, you ended up with empty casks, right? Now, there's a bit of a common misconception, and unfortunately it's repeated by many people in the whiskey industry, that the story went that the canny Scots sort of hoovered up all of these empty barrels that were just lying around the docks. That's not true. These casks were very carefully manufactured by the Spanish to sort of secure and beneficial vessels for their wines during export. And there were sort of benefits, tax benefits, if they re-imported them back into Spain. So they would often be used multiple times. These casks would go back and forward between Spain and Scotland, and then eventually somebody might buy them. And often that was Scotch whisky distillers. And these types of casks were in such demand at that time that actually they were buying these casks in advance from the sherry producers. They were saying, we're going to pre-buy the sherry butt that's going to be used for shipping, and then you're going to use it a few times, and then you send it to us. So the sherry and whiskey has gone hand in hand actually since at least the early 19th century. Tamdhu is the distillery that really embodies that legacy for me. It is a family-owned distillery, as I mentioned, and they have maintained a relationship that was founded when Tamdhu was owned by the Edrington Group, which is the company that owns the Macallan and Highland Park distilleries. And anybody that's had Macallan will know that they are very famous for their sherry cask matured whiskies, and in many ways pioneered a supply chain process that allowed the creation of incredibly high quality seasoned sherry casks. And by that, what we mean is these are casks that have been made bespoke for, at that time, for Macallan and Highland Park, but also for this distillery Tamdhu. And that is a supply chain that was sort of grandfathered in when the Russell family purchased Tamdhu distillery from them. But let's have a little taste first, though. So we've have a little nose. So Tamdhu, the new make spirit, is actually quite a robust spirit. I think in some ways it can be thought of as a bit of a sibling to Macallan. The still shape and the production process is slightly different, but it definitely makes this very full-bodied, robust, very intensely fruity, sort of red apple, particularly dominant new make spirit. Mm-hmm. And then when it's matured in these exceptional sherry casks, and Tamdhu is only ever matured in sherry casks when it's going to be released as single malt. The distillery does fill ex-bourbon barrels and other types of casks, but they would only ever go for independent bottling or blending. So any whiskey today that's released under this Tamdhu label is 100% sherry cask matured. And what we can find from that is, I get sort of Seville orange marmalade, mm-hmm. raisin, date. There's a delicate nuttiness on the nose as well, which I hope is going to go very nicely with this. What do you think?
I think your olfactory is far more developed than mine, but this is what's great about walking through this with someone else and doing it with other people, is to kind of go back and forth with one another. I definitely smell a little bit of honey. There's a sweetness to the nose. And the red apple, it's one of those things that when you say it, right, it almost immediately comes into my mind. But it wouldn't have been something that I would have picked on initially, probably for a lack of kind of olfactory vocabulary.
Well, so let's have a little taste.
Delicious. So whenever we're tasting, how one should allow the Scotch, to wash across the palate. Because I know with, smoking a cigar, you're tasting it in the palate, but also in a retrohale. And oftentimes whenever I'm, really trying to discern kind of the nuanced flavors, I'll even kind of swish the smoke around in my mouth, as you just did with your Scotch. The same has to be true in tasting.
It really is. One of the first things I was ever taught about tasting Scotch whisky was at an event, Meet the Blenders event, back when I was working well over a decade ago at the Scotch Whisky Experience in Edinburgh. There was an event where numerous blenders were invited to talk to the team that worked there. And that was the first time I met Richard Patterson, the master blender of the Dalmore. And he saw me. I was sort of, I drank whiskey at that time. I actually drank quite a bit of single malt, but I didn't do much assessment. I was more, I was a young guy. I was a young guy. I thought I just liked tasting it. And he saw me sort of nosing kind of like this, sort of a little bit shyly. And he said, no, really, really, really get in there. And there are some people today who say, oh, no, you shouldn't shove your nose sort of right into the glass. You're going to numb your nose and make it more difficult to identify aromas. But I'm personally not sure that I completely agree with that. I think there are certainly some whiskies that if they're very strong and sometimes and very hot, they will be unpleasant to nose like that. But this whiskey is incredibly delicate. You can get your nose right in there. And what you will find is sometimes you will be able to notice different aromas if you smell from above the glass than when you actually put your nose right in. So I certainly wouldn't be afraid of really getting in about it and trying to identify different aromas during the nosing. Then you want to taste. So I would say, it's not you can take tiny sips, but we say usually take a reasonable sip and move the spirit across your palate. What you're really trying to do is sort of get it into all the nooks and crannies. And actually you are almost retrohaling the aromas, because it's traveling up the back of your nose, and you will sometimes pick up notes when you're tasting that you wouldn't otherwise have picked up just simply from nosing. Mm-hmm. And then we talk about the finish. So we've had the nose, we've talked about the palate, and then we move on to the finish. And the finish is the flavors and aromas that you can detect after you've swallowed the whiskey. Mm-hmm. So sometimes, at the most basic level, we say to people, well, is the finish long or short? Did the flavors dissipate very quickly, or did they persist for a long time? What could you taste things on the finish that you couldn't taste when the whiskey was actually in your mouth or when you were just nosing it? So we try to get people to consider each stage. In terms of actual liquid assessment, for instance, when I review whiskies for Whisky Magazine or for the World Whiskies Awards, we're looking for balance. Are the flavors in balance with one another, or does one dominate? We're looking for complexity. How many individual flavors can you identify? Is it a 100-piece jigsaw or a 2,000-piece jigsaw? Or in the case of whiskey, is there sort of 5 or 6 flavors, or maybe as many as 20 that you can identify? We also obviously look for faults. Now, none of these whiskies are going to have production faults in them, but if you're nosing single cask whiskies, sometimes, the distiller has to do their due diligence as part of their quality control process, and they'll be looking for things like excessive sulfur that maybe happened if there wasn't enough copper contact during distillation. If something had got into the cask that wasn't meant to be there during maturation, there can be problems. Has it become over oaked? That can be a fault as well if it's very tannic and drying when you taste it. So there's various faults that we can look out for, but most people are not going to have to worry about that when it comes to this. There is a very diligent quality control processes, just like in Cuba, that we've both seen at the factories there.
What do you think?
So I think for me, interestingly, tasting the whiskey first and then this cigar, for me, has dialed up some of the woody flavors in the smoke. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of those cigar box aromas. For me, I would say it's maybe even dialed down some of the sweetness that was present in the Trinidad. What about you? What do you think?
I found that, this is very full flavored. Right, it has a sweetness. It hasn't been chilled, so we're tasting more of the alcohol. And it has a very long finish. I found that in many ways it overpowered the cigar. Mm-hmm. I felt that whenever I took that puff, from this beautiful Trinidad Topes, that I really didn't discern much of the flavor of this cigar. I was still experiencing the finish, and in some ways, kind of that burn of the alcohol of the Scotch whiskey.
Okay, well, let's try it the other way then. So we've had our sip of whiskey, and now let's try the smoke.
Yeah, I mean the first puff of the Topes, I get sweetness. You can taste the sweetness on the front, the tip of your tongue. Yep. It's very well balanced. A little bit of cream, right? It's not super wide, like a Partagas, in terms of really strength. And let's see what we get here. Yeah, and I think that brings out a little bit of the sweetness of this, and maybe a little bit more of the butterscotch. Still has quite a long finish. I'm still kind of finishing that alcohol kind of burning off. And I would say that the Scotch coming after the cigar enhances the Scotch more than, say, the Scotch enhancing the cigar.
I would agree in this case. I think that's probably the direction I would go in with this particular whiskey.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point that I'd never really thought about, because normally if I'm drinking spirit, a Scotch, or oftentimes a bourbon, I'm really drinking it after I take that puff. And I'm interested to experience, as we go through the three, doing the sip first and then the cigar to see how those the spirit enhances the cigar versus the cigar enhancing the spirit, or the spirit being used to cleanse the palate. Exactly. So that you can re-experience, that flavor and kind of reset the palate.
Exactly. And what I'm finding particularly here, now that we've had a few tastes and a few puffs on the cigar, I'm finding that the sort of dried fruit element of the Tamdhu is sort of persisting quite a long time. I'd say that this whiskey has quite a long finish.
What's the alcohol content?
This one is 46.8% ABV. This one here is 46% ABV. And then this one here is actually 100 proof. This is 50% ABV on the button.
Yeah.
Generally, what I would say to people, and I think this is a common misconception that we should address, there is among some people this idea that, if you've got a cigar, there's lots of flavor there and you need something really, really big in terms of the whiskey, and maybe something high proof. And while there are maybe some cigars, probably not Cuban cigars, but probably potentially some non-Cuban cigars, where I'd say that can sometimes work, myself and many of my colleagues and peers in the industry generally don't suggest going above 100 proof or 50% ABV when you're pairing a spirit with a cigar. And particularly something like this, which isn't incredibly full and full-bodied and full-flavored, I definitely wouldn't go above that 100 proof mark. And equally, I wouldn't be afraid of adding a little bit of water. So I think it'd be quite interesting if we pour you a little bit more whiskey and we can add some water and see how that changes the flavor.
Now, like wine, is there an optimum temperature at which whiskey should be served if it is intended to not be chilled? Because if it's too warm, just like with wine, you get, alcohol, right?
It's also quite disconcerting drinking warm whiskey. It's the only time that I would ever really serve whiskey warm is in a hot toddy, with honey.
I'm not speaking about necessarily warm, but even just within the range of room temperature,
exactly.
Right? I mean, we're probably at 70 degrees here, and the bottles have been in this room for a while. But if it were, say, at home, in the kitchen, close to a window, it could be at 74, right? And just that small variation can make a big impact in terms of how one experiences that alcohol.
Exactly, and I wouldn't.
And it's not like you intentionally warmed it, but it's still, I would say, not optimal. For Scotch, is there a kind of a commonly agreed upon room temperature at which Scotch should be served?
Well, I think a bit like cigars, I would generally serve a whiskey sort of at room temperature, so that 18 to 22 degrees Celsius that you would probably maintain your humidor at. I don't know that in Fahrenheit, I'm afraid. But what I would say is, you've actually raised a very good point. You mentioned maybe a bottle being in a kitchen near a window. And that's something that I would always say to people. Whiskey, particularly in clear glass like this, it doesn't like natural light. It doesn't like sunlight. UV will actually damage your whiskey.
Okay.
So if you have a cabinet in maybe your living room and you have your whiskeys, you would never want to put your whiskey cabinet where direct sunlight will be falling on it, because over time that will actually have a negative impact on your whiskey. And you're quite right that if the whiskey, for whatever reason, has become warm, when you add your water, you might want to make sure that the water is chilled.
Yeah.
So I'll give this to you and you can add it yourself. When it comes to adding water, you really only want a little drop to begin. I mean, some people, that's perfect. Sometimes people will use a pipette.
A dropper.
I think that can sometimes make you feel a little bit like you're in a laboratory. I personally don't do that. I think just a little drop, and then you can see how it will change. What you'll find with many whiskies is that actually new flavors will present themselves, and that's because the water and the alcohol doesn't become a completely mixed solution right away. There are actually some congeners within the whiskey that are slightly hydrophobic, so that will cause a current within the whiskey. And if you look very closely, when you've added water to a whiskey, you'll see sort of swirls inside the spirit. It's also worth saying that these whiskies are all non-chill filtered and natural colour. So in the Scotch whisky industry, particularly for mass-produced products, it's very common to bottle at around 40 to 43%, quite often 40%. And during the production process of those whiskies, they will actually chill the whiskey down before bottling and run it through a relatively fine filter, and that will strip out some of the oils and fatty acids in the whiskey that can otherwise, when reduced down to a low temperature, can sort of clump together and cause something called flocculation and kind of like a kind of cloudiness. So some whiskies that have been unchill filtered, when you add the water, particularly if it's cold water, you'll actually see it'll go cloudy, it'll throw a little haze, and that's absolutely fine. There's nothing to worry about, and all it means is that you've got lots of juicy goodness in your whiskey.
Yeah, you can see that also in a beautiful Habanos wrapper, right? The oiliness, right? And you see a difference there even between kind of brands within Habanos, or how much oil a wrapper may have.
Exactly. And I would say that there are some distillers who deliberately try to create an oily spirit, and there are others that actually deliberately, the shape of their stills, and particularly the angle of their line arm, which is the neck that comes off the top of a pot still, they will deliberately angle that to either concentrate oils back into the still, and they don't want to collect those, and others will have a line arm that's perpendicular to the ground, so that's neither very going to capture lots nor keep the oils back in the still, and then others will have a declining line arm, and that's going to make it more likely for oils to come over into the spirit that's collected. Would you like to move on?
Yeah.
Fantastic. So we've had our first whiskey. Well, it's time for our next whiskey.
Yes.
So let's move on to the Springbank.
Yeah, wow. Definitely getting different flavors now. And trying all three, we see how each interacts a little bit differently with the cigar that you wouldn't necessarily have picked up on if you didn't have something to compare it to.
Any enthusiast of Cuban cigars has to visit Cuba. I would say that taking a visit to Scotland to visit these distilleries is a pilgrimage for whiskey enthusiasts, and one that I encourage everyone to do at least once in their life. There are aromas there that you're going to then recognize in the whiskies wherever you're tasting them around the world.
Wow. I mean, it has a very complex, very sweet, very soft finish. And what's interesting is, of the three of these, it has the least alcohol at the end of it. Smooth and soft all the way to the finish.
With this specific cigar, I agree, it's a fantastic pairing.